Good morning from Glasgow, and I know it's good evening in Australia, and for all others in different time zones around the world, welcome. My name's Don Henry. I'm Professor of Environmentalism at the University of Melbourne, and I'm honoured to be welcoming you today to a session that's looking at transforming Australia from laggard to leader. And we're joined in this session by a great panel of civil society leaders from Australia. First, I'd like to acknowledge traditional owners of country around the world, and I'd like to pay my respect to their elders, past, present and future. Australia has a big opportunity to act with ambition on climate change, and it's in Australia's social, economic and environmental benefits to do so. We've got an opportunity to avert some of the worst impacts of climate change for Australia, and Australia as a country is highly vulnerable to the impacts of climate change. We've also got a lot of sunshine, and so we've got a chance to be a clean energy superpower into the future. But the evidence shows us that at the moment, at the federal level in Australia, we're in a laggard position. Australia has committed at this COP to net zero by 2050, but our 2030 targets at very best are only half of our fair share of global effort to properly tackle climate change and to implement the Paris Agreement. And emissions from our energy sector are substantially increasing. So there's big challenges, but there's also a lot of action happening at the community, business and state and local government arenas in Australia. We're going to explore that today, and we're going to explore why Australia's in a laggard position, and most importantly, how we can shift to a leader position. Now, I'm joined for this discussion today by, as I said, a wonderful panel, and I want to quickly alert you and introduce you to who we're going to have on our panel. Then what we're going to do is have 5-minute presentations or less from each of the panellists, and we'll move to question and answer, and we're looking forward to that discussion together with you. We've got with us today Ray McKinnon, the Director of Climate and Energy Program at the Australia Institute, one of Australia's progressive think tanks. We also have online Dr. Janine Mohammed. Janine's the CEO of the Litigation Institute, which is also a member of the Climate and Health Alliance in Australia. We have online as well Professor Jackie Peel, who's the Director of Melbourne Climate Futures at the University of Melbourne. We have Gavin McGadden. Gavin's the Manager of Climate Change and Clean Energy Program at the Australian Conservation Foundation. We have Dr. Virginia Marshall. Virginia's the inaugural Indigenous Postdoctoral Fellow at ANU and is here as a member of the Indigenous Peoples Organisation of Australia and a UN Indigenous Delegate for the Pacific. We have Pastor Ray McKinnon. Pastor Ray is Gubbi Gubbi, Gorang Gorang, and Ray was also sharing with me just earlier, and he'll share with us as well. He has links back to Vanuatu in the Pacific. So without further ado, let's move into our panel and presentations, and also enable that to get to questions for you. Could I firstly invite Ray McKinnon to present to us. Richie, over to you, thanks.
Thanks, Don. It's a privilege to be here. Never have I had to work so hard to leave Australia, but it was worth doing to come here and speak truth to power, to explain where Australia stands on climate change. And so I'll begin by setting the scene for where Australia is at in terms of its contribution to climate change. Australia is a major greenhouse gas emitter. In fact, it is in the top 10% of global emitters around the world. Australia emits more than 40 countries with larger populations, including our host here, the United Kingdom. Despite having a population more than twice the size of Australia's, the UK emits less. And it's got one of the highest per capita emissions as well. That's just what it emits onshore. Australia's carbon footprint, though, really should be expanded to what it deals out to the world. And the emissions and all the coal and all the gas that Australia sends offshore is more than twice the size of what it contributes directly at home. In fact, when you add up all that coal and all that gas, Australia is the third largest exporter of fossil fuels in the world, after Russia and Saudi Arabia. And according to new research from the Australia Institute, it only wants to grow that further. There are over 100 new fossil fuel projects in the pipeline, over 70 coal projects, over 30 gas projects. I mean, since the Paris Agreement, Australia has tripled its gas production and is now the largest exporter of liquefied natural gas. And you can't solve climate change, you can't have an energy transition if you keep growing the problem. And that's the problem, fossil fuels, and it's heartwarming to see the United Kingdom actually tackle that head-on with its Energy Transition Day yesterday. But the Australian people are also part of this. There's over $10 billion spent every year in subsidising fossil fuels in Australia. And for those who were at the Paris Agreement, they'd remember there were global protests against the new Adani coal mine. Well, just this month, Adani shipped its first coal from its Carmichael mine in Queensland. So there's a lot of work to do in addressing the problem in Australia, which is high emissions, but also even higher fossil fuel exports. Now, while it's good that Australia has a net zero by 2050 pledge, something that was quickly whipped up 2 days before the Australian government took off for its international expedition to Glasgow, the plan itself is a fraud if it allows fossil fuels to flourish. And that's what it does. It's based on the best possible assumptions that everything would work right and the technology would deliver, would be our savior, really. It also, according to new research and that was just published in the Sydney Morning Herald, is based on offtake agreements, which is that the Australian public would pay to lower the price of technologies to subsidise further the pathway rather than finding ways to make polluters pay. But the real issue is that there's no immediate impact to Australia's net zero by 2050 plan. And that's what we're looking for. How do we make 2030 count, the decisive decade, as President Biden put it? Because right now, Australia's emissions have dropped, not because of how it gets its energy, which is still highly reliant on fossil fuels, but how it uses its land, through land use emissions. Australia has a history of meeting by cheating. That is, lowering its emissions by finding loopholes and ways to exploit the international system rather than actually taking the concrete steps to lower its emissions in electricity, lower its emissions in transport, lower its emissions in terms of how we get our heating, how we get our food. If you compare Australia to the rest of the OECD, then in the last 15 years, Australia's energy sector has become more fossil fuel reliant, more high emitting, not less. So there's so much work to do if we want Australia to do its fair share. The final thing I'll add is that we can't rely on technology alone. That seems to be the government's solution, but it hasn't resulted in serious emissions reductions to date. And that's mainly because it really only supports the social license of fossil fuels. And there's one technology in particular I just want to name check, and that's carbon capture and storage. This is a technology the Australian government's been pushing for 2 decades now, to try and bury emissions and keep it underground as a way of further expanding fossil fuels. But over $4 billion has been committed by state and federal governments in Australia, and we don't have a single facility that's burying emissions that relate to coal, and only one for gas. We can't put all our eggs in the basket of technologies. There's a role for governments to play in actually bringing in serious policies and serious targets, and I'm sure we'll hear more from that from the esteemed panel I'm with today. So thanks for having me. It's good to be able to speak truth to power.
Richie, thank you very much for those comments. Really appreciate it. Now let me introduce our second speaker, if I may, and I'd like to invite online Dr. Janine Mohammed, the CEO of the Lowitja Institute. And Janine's also told me she's a proud Narungga Ghana woman. Janine, correct me if I've mucked it up on you. And you're also the CEO of the Congress, or was the CEO, sorry, of the Congress of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Nurses and Midwives Association. Janine, thank you very much.
Thanks, Don. And I'm going to share my screen with everyone, so I'll just take a moment to do that. But your pronunciation was perfect. Can we see that, Don? Yep. Is that all good?
Yes, we've got it now. Thanks.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for validating that. So like yourself, Don, culturally and respectfully, I begin such discussions with acknowledging the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation on whose traditional lands I get to live and work. I also acknowledge elders past, present, and of course, our future emerging generations, for which this discussion, this panel tonight is so important. I also acknowledge the Indigenous peoples and the countries from where you're all joining us today. As you heard, I'm the CEO of the Lowitja Institute, which is Australia's national Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander community-controlled research institute. And today I commend to you a report that many of us have been working on titled Climate Change and Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander Health. And it's a discussion paper, and you can find it on the Lowitja website, which is here on the screen at the moment. It highlights, as my colleague Jackie, who will follow me, will also touch on, a landmark international rights case where 8 Torres Strait Islander peoples have lodged a complaint to the UN Human Rights Committee against Australia for breaching their fundamental rights to culture and life by failing to address climate change. Now, Lowitja funded and published much work on the cultural determinants of health and how culture is so important to life expectancy and health outcomes. And of course, that's closely linked to climate change. And of course, this is the first time the UN has heard such a case. In developing our discussion paper, we heard many stories of climate toll felt by Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander peoples, including one of our elders from Central Australia describing the impact of extreme heat. He told us that when he went away for dialysis, and many of you know that you have to travel long distances in Australia to receive healthcare at times, and this was the case for this gentleman. So he went off to dialysis, and when he returned home, he found his power had gone off because of extreme heat. This meant that his food and his medicines, which his life relies upon, had all been spoiled. And that this nearby waterhole that he's showing us here in the picture, that had been present in his community, in his, in his dreaming or his folklore for millennia, was drying up for the very first time, and so too was the flora and the fauna. So our discussion paper maps out clear calls for rights-based climate action and place-based adaptation and mitigation. It has 4 high-level calls.
Hey, Janine, can I interrupt you for just one sec? We're not seeing the slides now, so before you go into the 4 calls, could you just try turning your camera off? And I think that will allow the slides to come through. Janine, we're just checking it, and I'll give you a heads up once we're a goer here. And my apologies to interrupt you midstream there.
Not at all. Now,
Janine, give us, we're okay now, Janine. Steam ahead, thank you.
Okay. Thanks, Don. You'd think after how many months in COVID that we'd be able to get this right, this online stuff. So call number 1 for our discussion paper is to take action that respects human rights and achieves equitable health and environmental outcomes for Indigenous peoples. So the climate crisis is already disproportionately affecting the health and wellbeing of Indigenous peoples, as I've just told you in the stories that I've shared with you. Central to this is the existing inequities and the ongoing effects of colonisation and poor relationships. Whatever we do, we need to address these and not exacerbate them. Call number 2 is to value and centre our knowledges and our rights as Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander peoples. We've protected country for millennia. We were here at the last ice age, and we've survived, dramatic climate shifts. So we are intimately connected to country, and our knowledges and our cultural practices hold solutions to the climate crisis. 3 is to work with us to protect country and do the work on adaptation and mitigation planning. We need equitable access to housing, renewable energy solutions. Some of our communities are doing amazing work. And as you said, we are in a sunny country, and we need access to our lands and our waters, of course, and united efforts to stop our government ripping every mineral out of the ground. And 4, and lastly, but not least, create a movement for climate justice. So climate justice will affect us all, but some of us more than others, and we need to ensure climate action learns from historical truth-telling. Learn it, accept it, and commit to never repeating the wrongs of the past. And this, for us, is climate justice, and it's deeply linked to race relations in Australia. So in closing, in Australia, I'm sad to say we're always lagging behind, especially on human rights. In a first world nation, we have third world health outcomes. And we're the only nation with a colonial history whose constitution does not recognise its First Peoples. And the current government dismissed what was offered by Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Australians as a gift to the nation, the Uluru Statement from the Heart, and it called for voice, treaty and truth. For us at Lowitja, we believe it's time to go from laggard to leader and to an Australia we can all be proud of. Thanks, Don.
Janine, thank you so much. That's really, really good of you. Let me move us now to our next speaker. We can come back with questions, of course. Could I introduce online Professor Jackie Peel? Jackie is the Director of Melbourne Climate Futures at the University of Melbourne, a new institute set up within the university to elevate climate change research and engagement and action. Warm welcome, Jackie.
Thanks very much, Don, and I'm learning from my wonderful colleague Janine's experiences, so I'm also going to share my screen, but I'll turn my camera off first, so hopefully that will work well, and see what I can find to share there. And Don, if you can tell me if the slides are coming up at all?
Not yet, Jackie, but I reckon just give it a sec. We're just working on it at the moment, Jackie. You've got them up on your screen?
Okay. I've got them up on my screen, but I can, look, I'm an academic, I can talk without the slides if needed. If it's not coming up, Don, I can see it giving me the option to choose Microsoft Word PowerPoint. But nothing's coming up. So look, Don, I'll turn my camera back on.
Thanks, Jackie. That's really good of you.
And just speak to the notes instead. So I'd like to start also, like my colleagues, acknowledging the traditional owners of the land from which I'm joining you today, which is the Wurundjeri Woi-wurrung people of the Kulin Nation, and I pay my respects to their elders past and present and extend that respect to all First Nations people with us today. As Janine highlighted in her remarks, Australia's First Nations people have been a key and clear voice calling for greater action on climate change in Australia. And what I'd like to focus on in this presentation is how that aligns with broader public concern and calls for climate action in Australia, as well as the tools that are available to the public, particularly through the courts, to push for that change. We've seen through polling of the Australian public growing levels of concern on climate change and strong support for action to address it. And there's a recent report, Climate of the Nation 2021, released by the Australia Institute, which was published on October 13 this year, that really tracks public attitudes to climate change in Australia from surveys that now go back over a decade. Some of the highlights from the 2021 survey included a finding that 75% of Australians were concerned about climate change, an all-time high, that 82% are concerned about climate impacts that they're seeing in their lives, particularly more severe bushfires, floods, and species extinction. That 74% of Australians are asking governments to implement a plan to ensure the orderly closure of old coal plants and their replacement with clean energy. That 69% think that Australia should be setting targets and implementing domestic action to limit global warming to the Paris targets and to achieve net zero emissions. And yesterday we saw Energy Day at the COP. In relation to that, 68% of Australians saying they support a phase out of coal-fired power stations, and that 54% support a moratorium on new coal mines and expansions of existing coal mines in Australia. So the overall message, which is supported by many other surveys of the Australian public as well, is that concern about climate change in the Australian public is high, with support for climate action that is much more stringent than what we've seen put forward by the Australian government, particularly on coal and particularly on coal-fired power. What we're seeing is that the gap between public concern and that desire for action and where our climate law and policy actually is in Australia is providing fertile ground for a turn to the courts to seek, as Janine pointed out, climate justice, and also using courts as trusted apolitical institutions to help drive greater climate action. Australia has a very long history of climate change litigation. It stretches back to the 1990s, and the country has an extensive case law. The number of cases is second only to the uber litigious United States of America. And when we've done interviews with litigants and environmental groups, they say, look, the reason for this is policy inaction, particularly at the federal level, which has been a major driver of this turn to the courts. We've seen many cases that have a mitigation aim targeting new coal power and proposals for new or expanded coal mines. And for mining cases, what we see in Australia is arguments for the broader carbon footprint or scope 3 emissions of coal mining to be considered as a consistent feature. But reflecting the fact that Australia is also at the forefront of climate impacts and extreme weather events that impact our communities, including First Nations peoples, adaptation cases have also been especially numerous. And these are questioning the wisdom of development planning and infrastructure siting that fails to take adequate account of climate impacts, including more severe fires and increased flooding risks or sea level rise. Very few of the more than 100 climate change cases that we've had have actually stopped climate-friendly development proceeding. But the indirect impacts, although they're less tangible, can't be underestimated. These court cases have been important drivers of change in maintaining public focus on the issue of climate change, pushing governments to adopt more climate-aware decision-making processes, and more recently too, really alerting corporations to the possibility of liability if they don't transition their businesses for a low carbon economy. Finally, I just wanted to point to the fact that Australia not only has many climate change cases, but it's also been at the forefront of innovation in this area, especially since the conclusion of the Paris Agreement. And in the slides, if I was able to show them, there's examples of some of those innovative cases, but I'll just talk to them. Several of them have made headlines around the world. They include cases like that of Ms Sharma and other youth plaintiffs bringing litigation against the Australian government, arguing it has a duty of care to safeguard the interests of children when making decisions on the approval of coal mines under environmental legislation. And that's such a relevant topic as you're in Glasgow today talking about the role of youth and public empowerment. Another really important example very recently launched is the case by Indigenous plaintiffs, Paul Kabai and Pabai against the Australian government, alleging that the government has breached a duty of care to protect their homes in the low-lying Torres Strait Islands. So youth and Indigenous peoples are definitely at the forefront of a lot of this climate litigation. And as it shows, Australians across many different sectors of society are calling very loudly and very strongly for more ambitious action on climate change and challenging our government to step up. Thanks very much, Don.
Jackie, thank you kindly, and you did great without the slides, so no worries there. Thank you. It's my pleasure now to introduce Gavin McGadden. Gavin's the Manager of Climate Change and Clean Energy at the Australian Conservation Foundation. Over to you, Gavin.
Thanks, Don. Thanks to my fellow panellists, and I'd also like to recognise Indigenous people here and around the world, and that when I'm usually in Australia, I'm on Wurundjeri country of the Kulin Nation. I wanted to tell a slightly different story. There's deep frustration. We saw in the last 12 months, especially, deep international frustration with the position that it looked like Australia was going to take to the Glasgow Climate Conference. And that was one of the main reasons why the federal government was dragged, literally kicking and screaming, within days of the Glasgow conference commencing, to a commitment of net zero by 2050. But for our international audience, I'd like to also paint a picture of the extensive domestic pressure that was also being placed on the Australian government. It really was a perfect storm facing the Morrison government in the lead up to the Glasgow COP. We were seeing significant international pressure, but I'd like to share with you some of the domestic pressure that was occurring as well, and some of the significant movement on climate change that's occurring in Australia right now. Because people would be forgiven for thinking here in Glasgow that there's a lack of action on climate change in Australia. There's a lack of federal action. There's a lack of federal ambition, and there's a lack of durable, consistent policy with the targets to back it up. But the last 12 months in Australia has seen some remarkable movement from the business community and from state governments, including from state governments on the conservative side of politics, the same side of politics, of the same persuasion as the Morrison government. In the last 12 months, significant umbrella organisations such as the Business Council of Australia, the Australian Industry Group, the National Farmers Federation of Australia, the Australian Aluminium Council, Meat and Livestock Australia, amongst others, all committed to net zero by 2050, and many have interim targets of 2030 in the 45 to 50% range. Not the kind of ambition we need to see, but significantly stronger than our federal government. What this has helped create, and I'll talk about state government ambition in a second, is that Australia's projected for emissions reductions of about 35%, some say up to 40% by 2030, 10% higher than our federal government's interim 2030 target. How was that achieved? Well, it's been achieved by those movements, by the significant investments and movement by the business sector, and also, as I mentioned, by Australian state governments. And just to mention a few things, almost every state government in Australia has strong to very strong state-based climate change legislation, state-based action plans. They have emission reductions targets. Australia's two big economies, Victoria and New South Wales, have emissions reduction targets in the 45 to 50% range. Several Australian, well, the Australian Capital Territory has a stronger target even than that. There's some work for our resource-rich states to catch up, Victoria and Queensland, of course. On renewable energy targets, there's some very ambitious targets and policies by Australian state and territory governments. South Australia and the Australian Capital Territory have a 100% renewable energy targets by 2030, Tasmania 100% by actually next year, and Australia's three big states, Victoria, New South Wales and Queensland, 50% by 2030. That's combined with some strong and increasingly strong transport strategies. Victoria and New South Wales, Australia's two big states, have targets of new vehicle sales of 50% by 2030. That translates to 30% across the country. So this is what's driven, in the absence of federal government ambition, we've seen some really quite strong state ambition. And just to finish off, Richie mentioned earlier Australia's exported emissions, which are far higher than the emissions we generate domestically. So Australia can't have strong climate policy without strong exports policy, and Australia is actually in an outstanding position on this front. We have significant exported emissions, and we're an energy superpower to the world, but we can also be a renewable energy superpower to the world, and state governments in Australia have initiated some outstanding policies to move that forward. And ACF, the organisation I work for, the Australian Conservation Foundation, with the Business Council of Australia and the Australian Council of Trade Unions, recently released a report that outlined a roadmap to achieve that, and the huge renewable export opportunities that we have. And that's because Australia has the best renewable resources in the world, skilled labour force, deep ports, proximity to energy-hungry Asian markets, and that means the opportunities in direct renewable exports in hydrogen, green steel, green aluminium, even some critical minerals mining and so forth, means that Australia can still be an energy superpower, can still export our energy to the world, particularly into Asia, but it can do it in a clean way and not in a dirty way. So just to finish off, there's a lot happening in Australia. There's no replacement for federal action, and I wouldn't want that to be a takeaway from what I'm saying, but there has been significant domestic movement on climate change in Australia by both the business community and by state governments, which have pushed our federal government kicking and screaming to a net zero by 2050 target. And we hope before the next federal election, due by May next year, a stronger set of interim emissions reduction targets as well. Thanks, Don.
Gavin, thanks so much. Much appreciated. Could I now invite remarks from Dr. Virginia Marshall? Virginia.
Oh, thanks, Don. Look, I think it's really important to start on this position that, first of all, we do acknowledge those elders, past and present and emerging, because on their incredible legacy we're here today. And for all Australians and people who visit us from across the world, it's an Aboriginal environment. We've been looking after this for 60 to 80,000 years, and we are leading, and we've always led. The issue is that we have to have Indigenous peoples at the table leading. And I can see across many of the institutions in Australia that basically this is not happening. And we really enjoy a great support from the NGOs and environmental NGOs, etc. And that's really a phenomenal difference for us and where we can go. The issue that we have, and I know in water security, which was one of my areas that I lead on in Australia, on Indigenous water issues, is that we need water security. And that's incumbent on everyone in this planet to ensure that Indigenous peoples have access and also the ability to make decisions. Very rarely are we in the position in Australia, for example, to lead on that. And another issue that we have as well is Indigenous science and knowledge. Now, we know across the ANU, for example, that these issues are really important. So Indigenous science provides us with those answers to climate change, but Indigenous knowledges is a really important part of climate change solutions. And I know in the work that I'm doing at the ANU, it means that we're looking at how we can use that knowledge to support the Western science. So that's critical. And having young people across the world, Indigenous young people as well, which we have a lot of demonstrations today, and people really standing up for principles and obligations that they know as being part of this human society, that's really important. So, you know, there's a lot of work we're doing, but we also need a radical change in the way that we look at our laws and legislation. Because as a practicing lawyer, we need to put human rights back in legislation. It can't happen on its own. We have to have bipartisan support of all of those senators and the MPs across Australia and across the world that can see that we need that security, not only in water, but also, as I said, with Indigenous knowledge and sciences. We need a federal Bill of Rights. I think Michael Kirby's been saying that for years, and many others. But we also need, as Janine said, voice, treaty and truth. truth-telling, because every place in Australia has a dark history. And we need to also elevate those stories in truth. So if we start in truth, this whole experience at COP will be worth it. And next year, it'll be even worth again going through the stress of presenting yourself with COVID tests every day, and also, you know, being here with our international colleagues. There's so much to gain. We're so privileged. There's only 4 Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people here because of COVID, but I tell you what, we're packing a punch, and it's really exciting, and we're very honoured to be here. Thank you. Managua.
Virginia, we're very privileged to have you here, so thank you so much. Pastor Ray McKinnon, Ray, would you like to offer some comments for us, please?
Yes, first of all, on behalf of my ancestors, I'd like to acknowledge that I'm here on the land of the Scottish people, and I want to acknowledge their elders and the ways in which they have looked after their country and looked after their people. I guess I'm coming here, this is my first attendance at one of these conferences here, and I just want to say, from my perspective, my observation, I'm very, very disappointed in our Australian government, because it's clearly demonstrated that they are a bunch of hypocrites, because the government here is supported by the mining industries and all these extractive industries that have come here and showed us, or trying to show the world actually, what they're doing. That's such a hypocritical act that they've done here, because this is a climate change conference. It's not a trade conference. It's not a trade fair. And so they bought all this equipment, all of these people to show all of their stuff. There is nothing to do with our Aboriginal people and all the things that we bring to the table. And so it's like we're terra nullius again. We don't exist. And so when Scotty Morrison says, you know, he's doing this for all Australians, I just want to say to him, it's -1. I don't want to be included in your vision of Australia, because it's not my vision for Australia. We face a crisis here that is of enormous risk to our communities, and we Indigenous peoples are at the forefront of all of these risks. Wherever there's mining, there's always pain and struggle for our people. Wherever there's any of these kind of extraction industries operating on our land, our sovereign lands, there's always pain and struggle and suffering for our people. And we want to make that stop. We want to have a better say in our country. We don't want to be patronised. I hate being patronised. My head is going bald from being patronised. We don't want paternalism either, a paternalistic government. And this is what this government is doing at the moment. They think that they're being so paternalistic and using these incredible big, powerful industries to prop up their climate change thing. That's so hypocritical. And so I just want to say to the Australian people, listen to who, or watch or observe as to who your government is listening to, because they're not listening to you, they're not listening to me. They're listening to the mining companies, their executives and their shareholders. Wake up, Australia. We've got a country to save, and we haven't got much time to do that.
Ray, thank you very much. Ray, you've touched on a question that I'd like to invite some thinking and comments from other panellists on, if I could. Particularly for an international audience, they might be thinking, why has and does Australia struggle so much with climate policy at the federal level? And I wonder if we could just take a moment to unpack that a little bit. You've touched on it with the importance or the power of mining in the Australian economy, Ray. Could I invite any of our panellists just help unpack that a bit? Why has and is Australia struggling at the federal policy level on this crucial issue of our times?
Well, I think one thing is, and I think Uncle Ray said it so well, is that we rely on resource extraction. You know, there's royalties for regions, for example, in Western Australia, and communities in a strange and very weird way are waiting to get royalties from extracting their own resources, resources that AKA are owned by multinational companies and leases and tenements, but you know, that resource extraction reliance also means it closes the door to conversation for us to really talk about the issues that we're talking about today, which is protecting our planet and planetary health. So, you know, we've not got to be so reliant on fossil fuels. There's so much to be gained. And actually, if you think about company shareholders and the reaction with Duke and Gorge, when that was exploded, when everybody across the world, it's very much like George Floyd, you know, when he was murdered in front of everybody's eyes. Well, we can see the destruction of cultural heritage happening before our eyes, but company shareholders made a huge difference. They actually impacted on whether the CEO stayed or not. So wouldn't it be fantastic across the world with Indigenous communities if they could really gain that voice by really exercising their rights as shareholders? You know, that's brilliant. So you're not actually alone. You can actually make a difference through those structures that you're actually engaged in.
To that, Donna, I agree with everything you said, Virginia, but for our international audience, there are some very powerful, wealthy and with exceptionally good political access forces operating in Australia and have done now for a few decades, particularly on the conservative side of politics, but on both sides of politics. In Australia, the federal conservative side of politics is a coalition of a Liberal government and a National Party government that claims to represent rural and regional interests, but over the last 20 years in particular has become significantly captive of the resources and in particular the fossil fuel sector in Australia, and therefore its political access is extremely high. It's able to run also very well resourced and effective campaigns that aim to persuade parts of the Australian public, particularly in regional and rural Australia, but across the nation, that Australia's wealth is contingent, not just influenced by, but contingent on fossil fuel extraction and any climate policies that attempt to rein in Australian fossil fuel extraction and use will have a devastating impact on Australia's economy when really nothing could be further from the truth. And so these forces have had significant political persuasion over Australia for now really 5 or 6 election cycles, and have only just recently, as that nexus been broken through, as I said, particularly by parts of the business community and of state governments, where now climate action is seen as not only the right thing to do, it's not just a moral imperative, but it's seen to be in the best interest of Australia's economic future because of the jobs that are available in renewable energy and in obviously all the technological revolution that's going on associated with climate change action, but also Australia's agricultural sector, which relies on a safe climate. And so that political influence, that financial influence have been very persuasive and very corrosive to the Australian debate, the public debate when it comes to climate change action in Australia, and has been quite divisive.
Richie, I'll come to you in a sec. I can see Jackie's trying to get in, I think. Jackie, could I invite you to comment, please?
Thanks very much, Donna. I agreed with everything that was said there, but I just wanted to add in that we have had this incredibly toxic environment at the federal level in politics, a partisan environment where climate has become a sort of touchstone issue that divides between the federal political parties. Uncle Ray and Virginia pointed to the role of our resources industry and as being a major factor there. Gavin highlighted the lobbying that goes on and the political power that's exercised. But our media and the dominance of our media by the Murdoch press has also been a really important factor up to very recently in shaping the debate in Australia. And it's meant that we've had what's been called the climate wars, where we've effectively had flip-flops flip-flopping of laws and policies, and several leaders losing their job as leaders as a result of these partisan debates that have really paralysed any forward movement on climate policy. It's part of the reason why in Australia we've looked for less partisan environments to try and take policy forward, whether that's the courts, whether that's civil society, whether it's state governments, or in business. It seems that the bottom line, if the bottom line is money, that's less captured by partisan politics. So it's because of that extreme partisanship over this issue at the political level that we've seen this sort of move away to anything but the federal government to try and drive policy. But it leaves a massive hole when we need national leadership on issues to respond to international agreements like the Paris Agreement and the sorts of things that are emerging in Glasgow at the moment. Thanks, Don.
Can I just have one word? And I think Jackie and I know, because we're both practising lawyers, that, Jackie, it's really true that, you know, with climate change legislation, the people that really can't fund those actions are Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. So, you know, what happens? We don't get to court. And that's the struggle. As a pro bono lawyer, I know that that's something that I do because I love to. But, Jackie, you know, this is the situation. We won't get our communities going to court. They just can't afford it.
But why should we go to court? Why should there be litigation? I mean, that's not the path of democracy. I mean, it's just stupid that we have to continually go and ask a judge to make a ruling on what our government is doing to us. That's just not a democratic system.
Ray, let me bring Richie in. Thanks.
No, building off Uncle Ray's comments, it's exactly right, because it's undemocratic. And really it comes down to state capture, which is a federal government that assumes that the national interest is the fossil fuel interests. I mean, like, just 2 years, at the last COP, Australia was on fire, supercharged by climate change, and yet Australia's minister here at the COP didn't even mention it in the national statement. It was otherworldly. And then, you know, we went through a whole summer where the country was on fire and the government refused and dragged its heels to even mention the connection to climate change, because they'd be forced to do something against what they saw as their national interest, which is the fossil fuel interests. And then we had a pandemic. The government's response was to say, okay, we need to set up a task force to recover from the pandemic and then appoint a gas executive to lead the task force. And then they come back with a gas-fired recovery to the pandemic. And look, this is not just in the federal government, right? But as Gavin was saying, this is decades of money being poured into the media, as Jackie said, and to politics, to the point now where, according to the Climate of the Nation 2021, Australians believe that there are more than 40 times the actual number of people working in the gas industry than there really are. There's about 25,000. People think it's more like 1 million. The same can be said about coal. Right? The work is that we think we're highly reliant on fossil fuels because the system has built a conception that we are. But there are more people in Australia who work at McDonald's than work in the coal and gas industry. And until we start changing this, then the government will always have a stranglehold on our climate policies and rob us of our democratic right to actually have leadership to protect our country.
And by the way, more people working on tourism and nature-based recreation on the Great Barrier Reef as well. With your permission, can I move us into the so what space? Okay, how do we, what needs to happen? How do we shift from a laggard to a leader? And if I could suggest this, maybe firstly, there is a link here between these two discussions. We do have some regional communities that are reliant or significantly reliant on fossil fuels. We could be talking about Central Queensland, we could be talking about the Hunter Valley in New South Wales. So let's first talk about, if I may, just transition. Now, how do we do a transition that's socially just? So could I pose that question to start moving us into how do we shift from laggard to leader? Who'd like to grapple with that?
One thing that we could do is take a leaf out of Costa Rica's books and sell our military. And particularly that 50 multi-billion-dollar flaming sub that this idiot's bought, and invest all that back into land regeneration. That's just one solution. There's many others, but that's one. Sell your military. Get rid of the military. We don't need to go to war with China or anybody else in our region. Our priority should be protecting our country.
I think obviously a just transition is really critical, and nationally coordinated with strong local voices would be the way to go if possible. I think before that, just to acknowledge what our Indigenous speakers have been saying, I would argue first and foremost we need a treaty with First Nations people, because First Nations...
Federal treaty.
We need a federal treaty.
That's really important.
And I know there's been quite a lot of criticism even amongst First Nations people about the treaties that are being planned in Victoria and in Queensland. We need a federal treaty, because that might seem peripheral to some people, but why it's important in the climate space and the just transition space is that First Nations people have the wisdom and the answers about how to care for the Australian landscape, one of the most biodiverse countries and continents in the world. And then we need a coherent federal policy architecture if we can get one. The politics is shifting federally in Australia. Our federal government didn't want to do a net zero by 2050 target. It didn't want to bring it to Glasgow. It was forced to bring it by domestic and international pressure, and significant internal turbulence within the Conservative side of politics, including within the National Party, which itself was split on this issue. There were some quite strong voices within the most conservative of the major parties, the National Party, pushing for stronger climate action itself. So that's a party that is going through some kind of sort of internal implosion itself over climate change, and there's that political turbulence now which is shifting in a way it hasn't before. When it comes to local communities that have been somewhat dependent on this sector, like Gladstone, where I work quite a bit, those communities, even in the last couple of years, have seen significant shift. They know that coal-fired power stations are towards the end of their productive life and are not going to be replaced with coal-fired power stations. They're going to get replaced with the jobs and the economies of the future. And there's a greater now, I think as the rubber's hitting the road and we're seeing the reality of a hydrogen sector, we're seeing the reality of a big renewables build in Australia, I think those futures, those jobs have become much more tangible to those communities. They're not theoretical, they're real. And I think that has shifted public opinion just in the last couple of years in those communities. I'm not saying there's not resistance to change. Of course, there's fear and trepidation about change. It's all very well to be very strong in your support for climate action in places like Melbourne and Sydney compared to these communities that are at the front line of that change. But I've seen significant change happen, and I think those communities need to be put at the forefront of the future they want to see. They can't have plans for change to a low-carbon economy imposed on them. They need to be at the front of statutory authorities and other government bodies where their voices are heard and they have a real say in determining their jobs and economic future, and that's not imposed on them. And they have a lot of great ideas about what their future can look like and where those future jobs can come from. They just need to be empowered to be very involved in planning at the very local level to determine their jobs and economic prosperity for the future.
Well, that's really good, because empowerment is something that Janine's been talking about in her report, that Aboriginal people and Torres Strait Islander people are held captive on cashless debit and also income management for years. The Labor Party and the Liberal Party have both seen this as a really important structure to really put people and maintain them on social security. So, you know, if we're going to talk about climate change, we have to talk about getting rid of those sort of systems. And if we can't get jobs for people who are on social security and single mums looking after kids, single parents, and others on that poverty level, we can't deal with climate change. We can't have people, you know, struggling and kept on that system on $40 a day. And we know that there were politicians in Australia who said, look, quite frankly, I can't live on $40 a day. So that's part of the whole argument to deal with climate change. If we can't just deal with those sort of basic policies with social security, how can we deal with this inclusive argument about climate change? It's going to be really tough.
And it is a clear question of the vision that we have for our country too. We are a visionless country at the moment, and our leadership isn't offering us the vision that we want. I mean, I'll be a little bit more radical than everybody, and you can, cut me off. But I think we need to revisit our constitution. We can't continually have a dysfunctional family from this country here run our country. That's me, That's my country, and I can't have a dysfunctional family owning it. And Betty's getting a bit old now, and I think it's time for us to renew the ways in which we want to constitute the country that we love and that we want to serve. And I think it's in that particular process that we can offer our future generations an opportunity to have a country that we can all be proud of.
So it's interesting here because the people dimension, the social dimensions are really important in a transition, and they're very broad. How a country relates to the First Nations people, how a country supports communities go through change. I just wonder, there's a vigorous Australian debate, but perhaps civil societies and others around the world could be sharing experience and knowledge about transition a little better, because there's lots of places in the world where we face these challenges. Perhaps now, mindful of time, let me open the question a little more broadly, and just to ask for comments and suggestions about how we speed up this transition from laggard to leader in Australia. How can we accelerate it? So let me invite any responses. I just wonder if perhaps I could invite Jackie in first. Jackie, I'm not sure if you had your hand up for this or something else. Do both if you wish.
Thanks, Don. I was really enjoying listening to all of those responses, and I think definitely vision, fair, inclusive and community-based or community listening is really important for transition in our regions. But I just wanted to point out too that research is also telling us that there are many experiences around the world, as you're pointing to, of communities going through these transitions that we can learn from. And particularly countries that have done it a lot better in a more orderly and inclusive way than Australia. Some of those countries are in Europe. Germany is often pointed to, and I think there is a lot of lessons that we can take from some of those experiences about how we might do it better in Australia. In terms of your what's the magic sauce, Don, to take this story forward, maybe because I'm a lawyer, I think good legal structures would help. It's a really sad thing, I think, in Australia that we don't have national climate change legislation. We've had it in the past and then we've lost it. But what we see with some of the countries that are moving very fast or faster forward on their targets and their actions on climate change is that they've embedded this idea in legislation or in constitutions of taking action on climate change, and that seems to bring about a change in the policy settings and also just the longevity of policy. In Australia, we've just had flip-flopping around consistently for more than a decade now. We really need to be embedding some of these values, including respect for our First Nations people, including respect for human rights, as part of our overall climate legislation and policy.
Yeah, Jackie, just a quick question too. We haven't even begun to talk about water and water security.
Yeah.
You know, that's really significant. And I sit on in the co-chair of a national water reform and Indigenous committee, and it's just stunning to see that nobody really wants to give up the water entitlements and water allocations. So, you know, we can talk about climate change, but you know, water is a big issue, and we're supposed to be on this committee for about another 18 months, and heal the woes of the National Water Initiative. So, you know, if Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people can't get access to even fresh drinking water, we saw that in COVID, and we're seeing that now where communities can't even bathe their kids. They can't even find fresh water. They've got to go and have bottled water, but bottled water comes from somewhere. It comes from somebody else's groundwater. It comes from somebody else's country. So, you know, we're not talking much about water security, and that's something that I'm leading on in Australia, but we need to. It's a serious issue. COVID is serious. Our communities are really increasing in the number of COVID cases. So, you know, we all have to talk about all of these combined issues. I think that's really important. Uncle Ray?
No,
You agree too.
Yeah.
Water's a big issue.
Water is huge, yeah.
And Virginia, they're really linked because a lot of the climate projections in Australia, particularly for southern Australia and the Murray-Darling Basin, have dramatic drying projections.
Because there's too many people. There's just too many people using water.
And it'll accelerate the challenges.
It's also our oceans too, because we're seeing those, you know, our islands now being swamped.
They're connected. And our creation stories say that ocean water
reefs
and fresh water is connected.
The only thing that I take away from here that might be a positive for me from COP is the fact that they passed the forest, looking after the forests. That could help to save the Daintree forests in those places.
Exactly.
Let me invite Janine. I don't know if you're okay if I invite you to provide any comments. I'm just aware you're online and it's difficult to have the community of discussion when we're half present and half virtual. But Janine, would you have any insights and comments on the question of how do we accelerate the transformation from laggard to leader?
Other than to support what everyone said, and yes, it's always hard to jump in, and when the conversation's so rich and already acknowledging so many facets of what needs to be done. But I'm a real true believer in the truth will set us free, and I think, you know, all of us have mentioned already the need for historical truth-telling, and I think it's important to acknowledge that when non-Indigenous people arrived here, they redefined what was normal, you know, even down to our seasons. We inherited the 4 seasons of England as opposed to the, you know, the place-based seasons, and that were already there. And so our ways of knowing, being and doing were rarely acknowledged. And in our discussion, what resonates for me is the disassociation that exists, you know, in our government to the community. I think we've all spoken about that so well today, that there's this real tension between power versus community, and you know, in that power I'm talking about money as well. So, you know, in that replacing of Indigenous ways of knowing, being and doing and redefining what was normal, we also lost sight of what custodianship of country meant, and you know, replacing, you know, that with ownership of country. And so I think that a lot stems back to that history. The power structures that have been established in Australia really give us a very good, I suppose, roadmap to where we are right now. And so therefore, we really need a dismantling of that thinking that we are not we don't own country, but we are a part of the ecosystem. And when country's not well, we're not well.
Janine, thank you very much. Great wisdom for us all. Let me invite some comments from Gavin and Richie on this question of how do we accelerate this transformation?
There's a lot of appetite on the home front to actually take action and not necessarily wait for the government. And so if you're looking at what Australians can do, then it's electrifying everything. So basically, if you look at people's transport emissions and then their household emissions, that's about 33% of our national emissions, is just in how people get places and how they operate at their home. And by electrifying your transport, getting an electric vehicle or electric bike or scooter, getting off gas in your home and putting solar panels on your house, which 1 in 4 houses already have, that's a huge way that you can make an impact. And more importantly, you can save up to $5,000 a year by 2030 because of how efficient it is to switch to electric. So it's like, it makes sense for economic reasons, and then it obviously makes sense for climate reasons. And that's within people's purviews to do right now, especially if we can get the incentives to ensure that everyone has that opportunity to switch, including those who don't have the capital up front, including those who need a hand along the way. So there's a lot of things that we could do right now to get things kick-started.
And just to finish off on that, we conducted a piece of research with climate analytics, an internationally well-regarded analytical research unit into this kind of work. And the findings of that were quite surprising at one level. It showed that a 50% emissions reduction target wasn't actually that a heavy a lift for Australia in some ways. Now, I know not all parts of the Australian community feel the effects of change evenly, but in terms of national policy, as Richie was saying, I mean, electrifying transport, lifting our renewable energy penetration, and if you throw in some energy efficiency measures and get stronger regulations on logging and land clearing, you get to 50%. Australia, it would shock some people to know that Australia is still one of the worst clearers of native vegetation on the planet. And so getting that under control as well. And you get to 50% right there. Now, I'm not saying you flick a switch and that happens, but neither is it this Herculean task that is often purported in some political circles in Australia that's economy wrecking. It's just simply not that. I mean, and as I said, durable, consistent federal climate policy is what the Australian public's calling out for, and it's actually what the business sector is calling out for as well. I was talking to some business interests just at the Australian Pavilion here, and they all said that, like, they'll take cash incentives from the Australian government to increase their technological development and penetration into the Australian economy, but they all said that they would trade that for a consistent national durable policy environment in Australia to be able to have a sustainable and reliable investment environment for business to operate in, and that they would, with strong targets, with clear and strong emissions reduction targets, and that's what they're crying out for. And if you did that, that wouldn't get us there alone, but it would be significant progress forward, along with some of the other things that Richie said around transport and stronger logging and land clearing controls and protection of nature and natural and cultural values in Australia.
But you think that one thing that we see at COP is the huge advertising with plant trees, plant 1 million trees. But for us as Aboriginal people, you've got to have the understory. You've got to have the tall trees. You've got to have the ground cover. You've got to have the species on the ground. You've got to have us there. So, you know, we've got to get rid of that whole idea about wilderness. You know, we need all of that combination. It's not just planting 1 million trees. And I think that's what I'd like to see too. More of a realistic view of an Indigenous position. I think that's so important.
We're getting near the end of our time. I want to give each of our panellists a moment to add some concluding thoughts, if you'd like, but consider this question as well. We've spoken about mainly what has to happen within Australia if we're to move to a leadership position. I think there'd be some listeners that would be interested in what's Australia's role in the Pacific, in the region and globally. So imagine as we shift to that leadership position that we need to, what does that mean for Australia's role in the world? I'll just pose that question, but I'll go round our room in presence and virtually to get concluding 1 minute, 2 minute thoughts, please. Richie, can I start with you at this end here, Tar?
If there's one thing that the Australian government could do right now, basically it would be significantly increasing its contribution to helping other countries take action on climate change. And that would include rejoining the United Nations Green Climate Fund, which is the main vehicle to support climate action, particularly adaptation and how you deal with those unavoidable impacts in our corner of the world. Australia used to have a leading role in this fund, helped build this fund, helped chair this fund, was the CEO of this fund, and then pulled out of it in late 2018 via an interview with a shock jock, and then hasn't come back to it. It's a major loss. It did a lot of great work in our corner of the world. It'd be great to see Australia rejoin that.
Gavin.
Well, couldn't agree more. So won't add to that other than to say Pacific Island nations are imploring, like, it's anger and now it's exasperation that Australia actually just gets its emissions down. And climate finance through the GCF and through a more generous aid budget into the Asia Pacific all help, but there's no replacement for emissions reduction. And for Australia to play a responsible role in the Asia Pacific requires Australia to take climate change far more seriously than it does now, because there's a fundamental disrespect to countries in the Asia Pacific going on if Australia just belligerently feels that it can be a laggard on climate change and not be conscious of the direct impact that's having on the very future, the very survival of Pacific Island nations. And so climate finance is absolutely critical. I couldn't agree more with Richie. But due respect to the future of Pacific Island nations requires Australia to lower its emissions as quickly as possible, especially in the near term.
Yeah. Virginia.
Well, I certainly think that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people will not disagree with what Richie and Gav have said. Yeah. But I think the most important thing is that as Indigenous peoples, we have to work with other Indigenous peoples. We have to be funded to do that. We have to be supported to do that through the NGOs that we are constantly asking in the United Nations Permanent Forum and MRIP and attending COP. We need those relationships to also be increased in the way that we talk about funding and aid. But, you know, we need to be physically present and we need to actually share that burden, and we need to also have a vision. That's so important to lead. And I think that if we can do that, it'll make a huge difference in the world.
Yeah, for me, in my observation, you know, we live in 3 tiers of government, and the government that's really at the closest to the people and doing the most in climate change mitigation is our local governments. And not only in our own country, but also in these other countries around it. And I know that they're coming together more often to actually talk about how they can do that locally. And, you know, the ways in which our Sydney of City there is opening up for more bicycles and other kinds of things and trying to mitigate against these things. If only the federals can listen to what they're doing, or how could we get rid of those and just go with the local government would be a better way of doing it. But the local governments in our countries, as well as in other countries, are the closest to the people, and they're the ones who are doing the most to try to mitigate against climate change. And I'd like to see more resources and more strengthening of our local community councils.
Ray, thanks. Can I invite Janine? Could I invite you in for some last comments and thoughts there? Thank you very much.
Thanks, John. Well, I think what I'd like to reiterate is that it's all in our report, but of course we'd like to do more of that. This was research led by Indigenous researchers, so we'd certainly like to see more evaluation and research done in this area, and certainly you know, more elevation of the solutions which are in our communities. And I think, Virginia, I'm sorry, I think it was you that said it before, but absolutely, you know, that global connection, those song lines with our brothers and sisters across the globe needs to happen. You know, Australia has a huge footprint. It's ignorant to ignore the Pacific. It's, you know, but then I hark back to, you know, the notion of terra nullius and just ignoring people. So it doesn't surprise me. You know, and in Australia we have a very strong identity of being fair and treating everyone the same. But treating everyone the same doesn't get the solutions or get equality or equity. We actually have to meet people where they're at, talk to people, be in community, have place-based solutions. But, you know, to this, I think what's very central is the existing inequities for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples. We saw it in COVID, that, you know, we're not a vulnerable population because of that. We need to be a priority population in any policy that goes forward because of those existing inequities.
Janine, thank you. Jackie.
Thanks, Donna. I think you've already heard from across our panel some wonderful solutions, and wouldn't it be wonderful if they were taken up by our Australian government? But I just wanted to highlight as a final thing the role of the international community and international pressure on Australia. At the beginning of the year, it was probably hard for most of us to contemplate that our government would be going to Glasgow with a net zero by 2050 target. That might not seem like a huge step, but I think it was brought about largely because of the international scrutiny, the international pressure coming from both governments overseas and communities around the world asking why isn't Australia doing more. That's been particularly First Nations people, it's been youth, it's been our Pacific neighbours who have just continued to prod the Australian government and voice their concerns of the need to keep 1.5 alive so that they can remain alive. So I think that the international community has played a big role in allowing Australia to step slowly towards a net zero target, and or what I'd like to say to our international colleagues is keep up the fight, and in Australia we'll do our very best to amplify that through all of our voices by taking action forward as much as we can to improve Australia's contribution to a safe climate future.
Jackie, thank you so much. That's a wonderful conclusion. We're out of time now, so what I'd like to do is firstly thank our wonderful panel here in the room and online. Thank you so much, and also sincerely thank our audience. Thank you kindly. Bye.